And let me just say, before we jump into Torah and Tarot, let me just do a plug for the Sacred Earth Judaism and Lake Erie Institute. I'm a big fan of, I follow, I'm a faithful fan of Nurit's writing on Facebook, because she always writes these really interesting quotes and summaries of what she's reading. I know you're a really thoughtful leader in spirituality and caring for the world. So actually your mission is much more important than my talk and tarot cards. So I just want to give if people want to learn more about the connection between Judaism and taking care of the planet, I highly recommend Sacred Earth Judaism, Lake Erie Institute. You have a lot to offer. So I just want to thank you for your work and all you're doing for the world. So thank you.
Thank you.
Shift gears to the more mundane topic of tarot. Hour and a half or so, I'm going to talk about my journey of exploring what I call the Torah and the Torah. And so first of all, let me, basically what I'm presenting today, I'm kind of presenting kind of the kind of a thumbnail summary of a thesis I have, which is namely that I believe the origin of the contemporary template of tarot cards, which was borrowed from something, an object of art called the Torah de Marseille. I'll go into detail on that. The thesis I'm presenting is that at its origin, there was a key moment when someone hijacked antique tarot cards and inserted a distinct Jewish agenda, Judaic content, at a time when it was forbidden for any public display of Judaism. And I'll go into detail about how I presented that thesis. So you're going to see, I'm going to kind of present this from a very, from the perspective of someone who's convinced, but let me first admit that I have absolutely no hard evidence for this thesis. There's always the possibility that I am a very well-intended person suffering from an overactive imagination. So I will tell my story. I'll tell you what I see in these cards, why I came to the conclusions I did, and I invite all you guys to reach your own conclusions. So how did we get here on this call? What was the genesis of this? So my background is I'm not a tarot card reader. I'm not a tarot scholar or historian. I'm actually kind of a very serious, straight-laced business professional. I make a living as a data analyst and a programmer for automation. I do process engineering. I work for Fortune 500 companies. I have an MBA. I have a very serious MBA from an impressive university. But I am someone who, I come from a semi-observant background. I am someone who studied Torah all his life. I spent a good number of years in Israel. So for me, I always studied Torah in Hebrew. I'm more or less bilingual. About 5 years ago, I stumbled on a deck of tarot cards that I didn't know that there was this older version of tarot called the Tarot de Marseille. And I stumbled on these cards and I thought they were really beautiful. And what I really loved about them is how they were filled with so many kind of really bizarre and puzzling images. It was filled with enigmas that were beyond explanation. And I just found it really interesting to play with them. And over time, I kind of developed this kind of odd obsession with them. I felt this need to buy more of them and buy books on them. And I actually began, for a short period of time, I started doing tarot card readings for friends because I thought it was fun. It was really interesting. And one thing that struck me as very strange is that when I would speak to other people who were passionate about these cards, who found them interesting and engaging, I found it strange that people didn't recognize the Bible stories depicted in the cards. And I would say, oh, don't you, that's a reference to Ezekiel, that's a reference to this. And in the tarot community, people were saying, no, there's no, what are you talking about? That's not a Bible story. That's a reference to this or a reference to that. And the more I explored the cards further, I became more and more convinced that there were Bible stories depicted in the cards. But after a while, I had this big realization one day that the reason the stories were obvious to me and not others is that the depictions assumed a literal understanding of the Bible, of the Bible in Hebrew. And that's when I began to realize that these weren't Bible stories at all. They were actually Torah stories, that they were hidden in a way that would only be accessible to someone who had read the Bible in Hebrew. And that was a very startling experience. And so I really methodically started to go through the cards one at a time and really dissect them through a Judaic lens of understanding, and specifically a traditional Judaic Hebrew-speaking lens of understanding. And kind of what unfolded from that is how really what led me to this point where I'm going around and trying to share people this kind of hidden story in the cards. Now, unfortunately, for me to really tell you more, I have to kind of take a couple steps back, and I have to kind of bore you guys a little bit. I have to kind of give you some historical framework for this conversation. Because if I jump right to the cards, some of you might be totally confused by the lack of historical context. So, like all good modern Jewish stories, this story is rooted in the events of 70 CE. But I should just admit, I'm going to give two historical lectures, one on the history of Judaism, one on the history of tarot cards. They're going to be really sloppy and really fast. I'm going to take a lot of shortcuts. So anyone who's well educated on either will be a bit mortified in the next 2 minutes. But I'm just plowing through that to get to the cards. In 70 CE, that was kind of the culmination of yet another Roman Jewish war. The military commander Titus was sent to Jerusalem specifically to once and for all to end the Jewish rebellion. He succeeded specifically by destroying the kingdom of Judea and exiling the Jewish population. And this was really the beginning of the Jewish people as a nation without a land. So it evolved from a national identity to a religious identity and a cultural identity. Titus famously was also credited for building the Colosseum. Some say he built the Colosseum specifically with gold taken from the Beit HaMikdash, from the temple in Jerusalem, which is also known as Beit El, or the house of God. Titus actually eventually became the emperor of Rome, and he passed away in the year 81. So he actually was 41 years old when he died, which means that he was only 30 when he destroyed Jerusalem. So that was not the end of the Jewish people. Of course, Jews went all throughout the Arab lands and in Europe. And one place in particular where the Jewish community really flourished happened to be in France. And one of the most famous sages of Judaism, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, who we call Rashi. Rashi taught and studied and wrote in France. Some of the greatest yeshivot schools of Judaism were in France. And you're saying this is a stamp that was made just a few years ago in France to commemorate the memory of Rashi. And this is why in particular, it was very painful in the 13th century when the relationship between the Catholic Church and the Jewish religion took a kind of a dreadful turn, and that the Catholic Church began to assert its authority on who had the right to interpret Holy Scripture. In 1232, there was a Jewish convert to Catholicism, Nicholas Dunham. I'm sorry, in 1240, Nicholas Dunham was a Jewish convert to Catholicism who alerted Pope Gregory IX of the existence of a document called the Talmud. And Nicholas Dunham told the Pope at the time that there was this massive volume of Jewish legend and lore that was filled with blasphemy against Catholicism. Pope Gregory IX, at this time, the Catholic Church didn't even know about the existence of the Talmud. So they decided to actually have a public trial for the Talmud. It was put on, so they asked the king of France at that time to conduct a trial. Several rabbis were brought in to speak in defense of the Talmud over several months. But eventually, in 1242, at the end of the trial, the Talmud was found guilty of blasphemy. And they collected some 5,000 copies of the Talmud in all of France, and they burned it in a public square. And this was really the beginning of the Catholic Church's efforts to really edit the articles of faith of Judaism itself. And they became much more aggressive in trying to convert Judaism in Marseille. And they did things such as force Jews to live in ghettos, force Jews to wear distinctive clothing, forbid them from certain lucrative professions. And over time in France in particular, they were not satisfied with censoring Jewish ideas or getting rid of Jewish books, but more and more they wanted to rid the country of all Jews. And there were several rounds of outright exiles of Jews in which the king would declare either convert to Catholicism or surrender your assets and leave the kingdom. The last exile was around the year 1400. And Jews were never allowed to formally live in France again until about the year 1675. So there was a period of over 250 years where it was absolutely illegal to be a Jew in France. We're going to fast forward. So in the year, but the French Jewish community at that point, because of the numerous cycles of exile, the French Jewish community was relatively small next to the Jewish community of Spain. And actually, Spain was in 1492, Spain was the largest, most prosperous nation. It also was home to the largest Jewish community in the world. 1492 was a really key year in the history of the world. Three massive events that changed everything. One is the kingdoms of Aragon and the kingdom of Castile managed to finally destroy the kingdom of Granada. So the Iberian Peninsula, for the first time in 800 years, became entirely under Catholic rule. And then the second decision that Isabella and Ferdinand made is they were so worried about ongoing insurrection amongst Muslims and Jews against their consolidated rule that they declared what's called the Alhambra Decree, which basically they said that any Jew or Muslim living in the Iberian Peninsula had a choice. They could either accept Catholicism or again surrender their assets and leave the kingdom. The third big event, so when they declared the Alhambra Decree, there was a large Jewish population, they say about 100,000 people, who refused to convert and did surrender their assets. And historians say that it is with those assets that they were able to fund Columbus's voyage. There are some historians that even say Columbus himself was a crypto Jew who was fleeing Spain, but that's highly doubtful. So this was a unique moment of crisis for the Jewish community in Spain. Again, the largest Jewish community in the world at this time. And they were confronted with this terrible dilemma. Again, they could accept Catholicism, they could leave, but many of them realized that there was a third option before them, that they could publicly convert, but in private, in secret, maintain as much connections to Judaism as they possibly could. And this phenomenon became known as crypto-Judaism or secret Judaism, this phenomenon of people maintaining an entirely Catholic face to the public, but maintaining at least some shadow of their Jewish faith in private. And it's hard for us to imagine. It's hard for us to imagine the mentality of the people of the 15th century, and that they really truly believed that their eternal souls were at stake. For them, it wasn't just a matter of their cultural identity. It wasn't a matter of whether their kids are going to continue the tradition of their fathers. There were large populations of people that felt that if they converted to Catholicism, their very souls were at risk. And this inspired this tradition of crypto-Judaism. And what's fascinating is that the knot of crypto-Judaism is still hasn't been untied today. Because what happened is that crypto-Judaism became so secret, people were so afraid of the authorities discovering their secret Jewish observance, that over generations, it became a secret even to themselves that they were crypto-Jews. So there are many reports of families saying, yeah, my family has a tradition of lighting candles in Friday night in a closed room, but we don't know why, just something we do. Or, yeah, my family every year we have a big feast for Saint Esther. I don't know why, it's kind of strange. Or in spring we eat flatbread. And to this day, they're still finding families in, particularly descendants of different Spanish colonialists out in New Mexico or in South America. They're still finding communities that are clearly the descendants of crypto Jews, but they didn't know about it. And of course, this is what inspired the work of the Inquisition, is that the Inquisition began to realize that when there was this mass forced conversion, it really wasn't clear that it was always sincere. And the Catholic Church, the Inquisition did not target Jews. Like they felt if Jews wish to risk damnation, that's up to them. But the Catholic Church felt an obligation to police the spiritual lives of all people who had converted to Catholicism. So if they did find a Catholic who was guilty of Judaizing, of practicing or preaching Judaism in secret, that was a crime punishable by death. And historians, there's a lot of debate about whether 10,000 people were killed by the Inquisition or hundreds of thousands of people were killed by the Inquisition. No one really knows. What we do know is that to call it the Spanish Inquisition is a misnomer, that the Inquisition actually, it went on for over a period of 700 years. It was persecuted in Spain, but also in Rome, also in France, also in New Mexico. And the jurisdiction of the Holy Office and the Inquisition went over the entire span of the Catholic world. It started in the 1400s, and the last victim of the Inquisition was actually in the 1800s. So we know it was a powerful phenomenon that stroked fear and animosity towards Jews for centuries. And this is really, originally the debate between Catholicism and Judaism was over faith, but through the pursuit of secret Jews and this suspicion regarding new Christians, people who had converted recently, the fear of Jews slowly metamorphosed into more of a racial hatred, something that someone could not so easily convert from. All right. So now we're going to take a dramatic shifting gears. I'm going to give you a very short lecture on the history of playing cards, tarot cards. And again, apologies, I'm going to take some dramatic shortcuts. This is an image of some of the first playing cards that were from Turkey. The imagery is very abstract because in Islam, it was completely forbidden to have images of a human being because of its association with idol worship. Somewhere in the 1400s, playing cards evolved into these are the very, very early tarot cards, trifoni, I think they were pronounced. But in Italy, this kind of form of art developed, where an artist would actually paint these images on playing cards. And these were high-end works of art. I understand that some people would commission them to be created at a wedding or a family celebration. So some wealthy artists would come and actually kind of paint these characters. And over time, there were kind of like standard characters developed. There was the magician and the fool. And again, the batch size of production was one. So one artist would paint one deck of cards, and they were really prized and valuable works of art. And now I'm showing you 3 generations of the same card, but created in very different periods of time. This card, all the way on the left, was around 1500. Again, one artist painted it. The card all the way on the right is the Fool card that probably most of you are familiar with. This is from the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, created in 1909. This is really the deck that made tarot cards popular all around the world. And the Rider-Waite deck, which incidentally was made by an artist from Brooklyn, Pamela Coleman Smith, but she and Arthur Waite, who was kind of like a new age guru of his time, they really largely based their design on a much earlier deck of cards called the Tarot de Marseille. The Europeans on the call, I don't know if you guys realize how few Americans know what the Tarot de Marseille is. We as Americans, we just know the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. We're largely ignorant of the Tarot de Marseille. The Tarot de Marseille, the oldest one we know of, was created around 1650. And there's this beautiful kind of folk tradition in France that many different versions and copies of the Tarot de Marseille were made. And they were largely used for game playing. And these were the cards that actually really utilized printing technology. So it was no longer one artist painting one deck. They actually printed them in batches and they sold them, and it was a business, and people used them to play cards. However, there's a really interesting mystery is that when you look at the Tarot de Marseille, they're kind of crazy. Like there's all sorts of really, again, weird, enigmatic imagery that defy kind of an obvious explanation. And it's kind of given birth to this like cottage industry. There's a lot of people who write different books and novels and stories kind of trying to figure out what's going on with the Tarot de Marseille. And there's kind of 2 large schools of thought. There are people who kind of explore the psychology and the spirituality of them. And there are people who try to find out what are the actual real historical origins of these images. And here I'm showing you kind of 3 generations of the Tarot de Marseille. The deck I'm really going to talk about is the one all the way on the left, which is the Jean Noblet Tarot de Marseille, which people say is the first, or we should say it's the oldest preserved copy of the Tarot de Marseille that we know. Now, there were a lot of other types of tarot decks and lots of other templates, but the Tarot de Marseille really, it's the symbolic template of creating a name and a number in this kind of classic 22 cast of characters that really had a big impact that I would say it gave birth to the classic symbolic template of tarot cards. And here's 3 generations of the magician. Here's the Visconti from 1500. Then there's the center one from 1650. It looks very different. And then again, on the right, Rider-Waite-Smith, you can see how the older Tarot de Marseille inspired the 1909 card, but Pamela Coleman Smith and Arthur Waite, they really brought it. They brought it in a very different direction. So what I'm really talking about is what was the intent, what was going on in the heads of the artists of this Jean Nouble Tarot de Marseille. So to kick it off, we'll talk about this card in particular, because this is kind of I think it's the easiest one for someone brand new to this topic to digest. Note what I've done is I've taken the classic card and I had an artist polish it, so it's a bit easier to digest. We can talk about the relative aesthetic benefits of the traditional card or my reinvention. So the first obvious question we have to ask is, what is this gentleman holding in his hand? So let's just observe that the oldest known example I've ever found of a magician holding up his wand, because this image eventually morphed into a wand very quickly. Even in the next version of these cards we have from 50 years later, it morphed into a wand. It forever became a wand. People always know the magician's holding up a wand. But in the oldest version, he's actually not holding up a wand. He's having what one might say, he's actually holding up a penis. And if you really scrutinize it, he's actually not even holding up a penis. He's actually holding up what is distinctly a circumcised penis. Now, I often go to synagogues and I give this talk at synagogues. And when I show this image, particularly, it was one fairly conservative, borderline Orthodox synagogue where I showed this image, and people screamed out the words, "Oh, he's a moil." Like even before I get on my mouth, they're like, "Oh, there's a tarot card with a moil."
That's what I thought too when you started to asking the question. That was that's where I went to.
So people have been scrutinizing this card because people have been examining it through the symbolic context of tarot cards and fortune telling. So they see it as kind of a funny oddity. But when you look at it in a different context, from a Judaic context, he looks like a moil. And these are images of antique circumcision kits, which would include a cup for drinking wine, a cup for spice, a small dish with sand, because after you cut off the foreskin, you put it in sand, a prayer book, there's a knife in its sheath, there's this little triangle object, which I believe is a magen. So there's something called a magen, a shield. It's like a triangle. You put the penis up to the magen and you pull the foreskin through it and you cut it so that you don't do any damage to the inner organ of the penis. Or you can see, and you can reach your own conclusion whether this is a coincidence or not. But it is interesting that his arms are held like the arms of the letter Aleph. And Aleph is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And Aleph also happens to be the first name of actually the most famous moil of all. Who's anybody want to venture? Who's the most famous moil of all time? The first moil? Avraham Avinu. Avraham was the first hero of the Torah. He's the first guy who says, "I'm going to enter into a covenant with Hashem, with the Lord God, and I'm going to do it specifically by cutting off the foreskin of my penis." Here's an image of this is kind of like a folk painting from Russia of a traditional circumcision. Note that it was traditional for a rabbi to officiate at a bris. He would hold up his prayer book, and it was traditional to wear tefillin. Tefillin are leather straps we put on our hand. The Torah commands to bind the law to our arms. So when we put on tefillin, we literally bind the law to our arms. And this is how the tefillin look. When you tie them on your left hand, you specifically form 3 letters, Shin, Dalet, and Yud, which spells Shaddai. It's another name for the Almighty. And if you notice, it's not just a penis. The shape and form of his left hand also mimic those 3 letters, Shaddai, Shin, Dalet, and Yud, that they're overlaid on top of each other. There's a lot more to this card. So for instance, there's three dice and there's 3 legs and there's 3 leaves. So this is where I'm speculating. I don't have proof for this, but On the dice, there are 15 dots in gematria, which is kind of like a Hebraic code. 15 is associated with the letters Yud and Hey, which is a short name for the divine. There are the three patriarchs of Judaism, are often sometimes they're referred to as the three legs of the chair of Judaism. So these are, and what I guess one other thing that would not be, so if you look at his hat, I'm not sure if you realize it's kind of a subtle thing that takes a while to sink in. But in the history of Judaism, there was a lot of debates about how much foreskin to actually cut off. So there were certain periods where people would get a little bit more relaxed about Judaic law, and they would cut off only a very small symbolic portion of the foreskin. Whereas the rabbis would repeatedly say, no, you really have to remove the entire foreskin. I personally believe, I'd make the argument that his head is actually a guide to how much of the foreskin to remove. It's a reminder that no, you have to fully unveil the inner organ of the penis. You have to remove the entire foreskin. The identity of all the cards are largely disguises. But a lot of the disguises have meaning. So there is something really beautiful that I believe that we know in France in 1650, we know there was a secret Jewish community, that they were people who were pretending to be Catholic, but they did their best under the circumstances they had to maintain some semblance of Jewish life. And so I think these cards in a lot of ways are a reflection of the crypto-Jewish faith, where it looks like this is the magician, but actually in secret, it's the moil. Interesting enough, there is, in the Kabbalah, in the tradition of the Kabbalah, there is a lot of literature in which Abraham is supposed to have magic powers. He was supposed to, like specifically, he was supposed to be able to make a golem. He was the guy who made a golem that would protect the Jewish communities. And in particularly, there's this very old Kabbalistic text called the Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Creation, where Abraham specifically is described as having, they don't use the word magic, but he has superpowers that he's able to manipulate the letters of the Hebrew alphabet to create souls. So the fact that they would disguise him as the magician, and I don't know, so here it's like I'm speculating. I don't know. It may have just been a disguise. It may have been as simple as that they hijacked the older tarot cards and used them as a disguise, and that was as deep as it was. Or it may have been this deep connection to this kind of like massive ocean of Judaic oral legends. So I don't really know. More direct, his head is also a penis. And his hat is the foreskin being ripped off the penis. Now that sounds really brutal, but if you read the Zohar is filled with declarations that the Zohar got really explicit in saying you have to remove the entire, they would call it the klipa, the shell covering the penis. And in the Kabbalah, and Kabbalah was very popular in 1650. It was actually kind of its peak popularity. The Kabbalists felt there was a special cosmic power in a circumcised penis, that it enabled a special connection to the divine. And that in order to enable that power, you had to remove the entire foreskin. It wasn't just a symbol. It had genuine spiritual power. So we're gonna do so just so you guys to know, I prepared content on primarily 4 cards. 2 are cards that I think people may have seen in other contexts, but after this card, we're gonna do 2 cards that I haven't done on a video before, so that I think that'll be interesting for people. This one people may have seen before. So this is the lover's card. On the left is what I would say some of the original cards from 1500. It's not there's not really a mystery in that card. It's a pair of lovers. There's Cupid. All the way on the right is the card from 1909. Again, it's a pair of lovers, but you can take a wild guess from the snake in the tree and the figure that this is actually Adam and Eve. Again, it's a beautiful image, but I don't think it has a lot of mystery to it. The second image, the card in the middle, the lover's card in the middle, there's a lot of debate. People write a lot of articles like, hey, who could this couple be? Why instead of a couple, now it's a trio? Why is it 3 people? Some theories are that this is a man and his newly married wife, and he's being given away by his mother. Some people say it's a man with his wife and he's being propositioned by a prostitute in the street. So it shows the tension between vice and virtue. But I'm going to offer a different interpretation today. So this is the card. So first of all, so like with the letter Aleph, remember in the letter Aleph, I showed you how there was a Hebrew letter hidden in the card. Anyone see a Hebrew letter hidden in this card? I'll give you a hint. It's the sixth letter, so it's the sixth. It would be the sixth letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which is the letter Vav. I'd say it's presented. It's disguised as that it's sitting right in front. It's right front in the center of the card is the letter Vav, right in the center of his card. So when you think of the letter Vav, and you're seeing a love trio, and there's also an angel who is blindfolded, is there any biblical characters that come to mind? Yep. So there's Jacob, Rachel, and Leah. So is there, besides it being a love trio, is there anything you can see in this card that would make you, that could be more of a compelling case that this might be Jacob, Rachel, and Leah? So if people don't know the story of Jacob, Rachel, and Leah,
well, the story goes that he didn't know who he was marrying and only discovered it after the wedding, right? Is that
right? So in the darkness of the night, he ended up marrying the wrong woman. So blindness. There's two themes in Jacob's life. One is blindness and darkness, and the other is actually angels. So he famously had a dream of angels traveling up and down a ladder. Jacob's ladder. So he went to a well. He fell in love. He went to his mother's brother, and he fell in love with Rachel. He agreed to 7 years of labor for her hand in marriage. But in the dark, but he was. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed a point. So when Jacob, the original role of blindness in Jacob's life is Jacob actually cheats his brother out of his birthright by capitalizing on his father's blindness. Isaac is blind, so he's able to convince his father he's actually Esau. And he gets the benefit of his father's blessing because of his father's blindness. And then later, when in the darkness of his nuptial night, his father-in-law cheats him by sending Leah, who has weak eyes, to cheat him out of his proper bride Rachel. So instead of marrying Rachel, he marries Leah. And then when he discovers in the morning that he married the wrong woman, he agrees to another 7 years of labor. So all told, he has to work for 14 years to his father-in-law for his 2 wives. So blindness and later when he leaves, he takes his wives and they're traveling in the wilderness, and he learns that his brother Esau is going to overtake him. He's so terrified that Esau is going to kill him that in the darkness of the night he wrestles with an angel all night long. And it's before the dawning that angel bless him with his new name, which is Israel. And that's when Jacob becomes Israel. And Jacob what's most important is that he's the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. His 12 sons become the father of the 12 tribes that becomes the nation of Israel. If you want to open up the secrets of these cards, you really have to look carefully, because I would say that the artists, they injected this story of the 12 sons of Jacob, of Rachel and Leah in this card in a very clever way. And I believe actually they injected it in a way, I suspect that they wanted this card to be used exactly the way it is in this context. Where I'm looking at that card, and that card is giving me reminders of the story of Yaakov, Rachel, and Leah. So I'm going to tell you something else. So, and I don't remember this. I'm actually, the notes for the story is actually from this card. Rachel and Leah famously, they had a competition on who could produce more sons for Jacob. Rachel knew that she had Jacob's heart, so Leah wanted to produce more children. She said, I'm going to produce more children. You can actually see this in the card, that one woman is reaching for his heart, another is reaching for his shoulder. And they had a fierce competition. But overall, as the competition heated up, they actually recruited their maidservants into the competition. Rachel had 2 sons, and her maidservant had 2 sons. Leah herself, she gave birth to 6 sons, and her maidservant gave birth to 2. Rachel had 4 sons. So in Rachel's camp, there were 4 sons. In Leah's camp, there was a total of 8. 8 plus 4 is 12. Those are the 12 sons who produced the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, the way I knew all that, I actually don't have it memorized. But if you count really carefully, you can see that one of the characters has 4 flowers in her hair. And the other one has 8 leaves. 2 of the flowers are slightly obscured because those are the 2 flowers of Rachel's maidservants. And here in Leah's hair, you can see that there are 2 leaves that are flat. They're kind of a little smaller. They're more diminutive. So what you see in their hair is they've kind of captured the family tree of Yaakov, Rachel, and Leah. Now, interestingly enough, there was one particular story where Leah at one point saw that Rachel's son had picked duvdevanim, mangrove flowers. One of the sisters hired Jacob for a night from her sister by giving her mangrove flowers. And actually, the flowers in her hair are actually in the shape of mangroves. It's another reference to the story of Jacob, Rachel, and Leah. And Vav, interestingly enough, there's a couple of reasons why the letter Vav is uniquely associated with Jacob. So one is that Vav is the 6th letter. And so Leah, famously, she won the competition by having 6 sons of her own. Vav also means and. So we say Yaakov, Rachel, Leah. Vav means and. But in the tradition of the Kabbalah, Vav is the 3rd letter of the highest name of the divine. It symbolizes the harmonization of 6 divine attributes. And there are several instances in the Torah where the name Yaakov is spelt with an additional Vav. And that gave birth to this tradition that Jacob is uniquely symbolized by the letter Vav, which is the 3rd letter of the divine. And here's kind of like an old Bible print of Jacob, Rachel, and Leah. So this is another famous card. This is the Hangman. This is a version of the Hangman from 1650, the original Hangman. Very quickly in subsequent versions of the Tarot de Marseille, the Hangman is no longer smiling. He might be seen as serene, but in the 1650 version, he's actually really quite happy. And it's one of the great thoughts, like, why is the Hangman happy? What is he smiling about? And this is what Pamela Coleman Smith did with the version on the right. For those of you who know Hebrew, the 12th letter of the Hebrew Aleph Bet is Lamed. And that if you know to look at it, you'll find half the letters present and half the letters are hidden. And you can get for me, I get a real sense of there's something going on in this artist's mind. He's showing enough so that if someone knows the secrets, they'll get it, they'll be able to make the connection. But he's concealing enough that if you don't know what to look for, you won't see it. So one thing that I wrestle with is whether this card is a symptom of confidence, because I think in the time of the Spanish Inquisition, this probably would have been seen as too risky, too frightening, or is this seen as? But I mean in the time of the Inquisition in Spain, where they were actively hunting crypto Jews, I think the community in France, when they mean this, for me, this is almost a sign of some growing confidence that they're flirting with showing themselves, but no ways truly being public. So who might this be? Who might this be? Does this? It's a hangman. If you notice, he's specifically hung from a tree. There are these trees on either side with cuts. And we have a very famous hangman, which is Haman. In fact, it's actually one of the major holidays of the Jewish calendar. On Purim, we all get together and we have a big party in which we celebrate the hanging of Haman. And let me walk you through how the story of Purim is hidden in this card. If you notice, on his shirt are 14 buttons, and the card number is 12. And by coincidence, in Esther 9:20, Esther 9:20 tells us specifically, this is how you celebrate the festival of Purim. It's on the 14th and 15th days of Adar, the 12th month. We are going to have you're supposed to have a joyous celebration, because it was on this date when they hang Haman. And for those of you who don't know, Haman was a villain who tried to kill off the Jews of Persia. But at the very end, he himself was hung from the tree that he had prepared for the leader of the Jewish community. So specifically, and Purim is known as the upside down holiday. It's known as the holiday of dramatic reversals, when something that is bad and something that's horrible becomes turned into something else. And the reason it's known that way is because there's a very specific line where it says, this month was turned over from one of grief and mourning to one of joy. So it's literally turned over. And this figure is literally turned over, and he is in joy. That is why the hangman of the Jean de Blé, the reason he's smiling, the reason he's happy, is because Purim is a day of joy. It's turned over. Haman didn't die alone. He was hung from an etz, which means he was specifically hung from a tree. But when he was hung, he was actually hung with his 10 sons alongside him. That him and all his sons were killed simultaneously for their crime of plotting the destruction of the Jews. And if you look on the sides of the trees, there are specifically 10 cuts for 10 other people to be hung. I'm a little haunted by this cut on top. I don't know what it means. This may be a reference to that Haman's daughter also died. Haman's daughter, there's a midrash that she poured a bucket of feces over Haman's head by accident, thinking he was Mordechai. She was so mortified that she threw herself from the top of a building. It may also be that with this cut, there's 11 cuts altogether, and the number 11 is a repetitive motif in these cards because it has special significance in Kabbalah, which I won't get into. And also one other thing is if you count the number of strands in his hair, they're precisely 16, which aligns with the letter Ayin. And Ayin is the first letter of Amalek, which was supposed to be the tribe of Haman. And also he has 12 stripes. And also in synagogues, when they read the Megillah, when you read the book of Esther, the tradition is to clap your hands really loudly whenever you hear the name Haman. You're supposed to blot out the name of Haman. And you can see his hands are, because that's just like a key part of a traditional Purim party is you're gonna clap whenever you hear Haman's name. And interesting enough, if anybody wants to see, you can go see the Hangman. If you go to really Orthodox communities, if you go to Meir Sharim, or you go to really ultra Orthodox communities in Brooklyn or Monsey, there are still areas where they hang Haman in effigy. You can see them have a party, and they will hang a large doll of Haman. And here I'm just going to show you a couple images. These are traditional medieval illuminated Megillot Esther, where they depict the hanging of Haman and his 10 sons. There's another one. Here's one that's more recent. And so this is, and Piotr, back to your question. I've read a lot of books on tarot history, a lot. I haven't found a single book on tarot history that has the word Haman in it, like not one. So there's no way I could say every deck of tarot had Haman, and everyone, and when they painted the hangman, they meant Haman. I can't say that, but I find it hard to believe that there is a unique Jewish voice here that for some reason just got lost in the shuffle. And I have a theory why it got lost. Here's a later version of the hangman. Lots of versions of the hangman. There's often depictions of money or pockets. Haman famously, the way he tried to kill the Jews of Persia was by giving the king of Persia a large bribe of silver. Hamantaschen, which is that cookie that we eat. Hamantaschen in Yiddish literally means Haman's pockets, because Haman's pockets were filled with silver and gold that he used to give bribes. I think this is a copy of the Convert made like 150 years later. I actually think the artist who made this card was not thinking of Haman. I think this artist was copying a copy of a copy, and that in his mind or her mind, she was actually onto something else entirely. But there was a kind of like a mythic echo, a symbolic echo still present in the cards. Because every artist was really I'm sure every artist was reinventing the cards over and over, and artists are still reinventing these images, and they're still echoes of the past, but they're incorporating something new at the same time. So it's a fascinating visual language that played out over centuries. It's just amazing. All right. So this is one of the most famous tarot cards, tarot cards called the Tower. Now it's such a really meaty, powerful card. This is the version made from 1909. This is the original version from 1650, where I believe it's the oldest version of the Tarot de Marseille, or it may have been the copy of an older deck that's lost to us. The name literally, the name is literally the house of God. Now, the house of God in Hebrew is Beit El, which is Bethel. So like if you ever go to like a hospital, it's called Bethel, Bethel Hospital. It's like it's a reference to Beit El from the Bible. So these words also meant hospital in French. So a lot of people think, oh, this is a hospital, but I would say it's Beth El, which is Beit El, which is in the Bible. Beit El is specifically the house of God that was built by King Solomon in Jerusalem. One of the things I don't like with its presentations is it can be an awful lot like someone reading the answer of a crossword puzzle out loud. I would much rather, and there's a reason why I only do a few cards, because I want to leave people the opportunity to look at these cards on their own with their fresh eyes and to wrestle and try to explore these images on their own. I mean, so most people, when they see the card on the right, they always think of the Tower of Babel. Like, oh, it's because it's called the Tower. Tower of Babel is the Migdal Babel. That is what most people see the Tower. But if you hear the words Le Maison Dieu, which I'm probably mispronouncing, or Beit El, Le Maison Dieu, again, I'm mispronouncing it because I really don't speak French. If we translated it literally into Hebrew, is Beit El. And Beit El features very prominently in not in the Torah, but in the Nevi'im and Ketuvim. Before we go deeper, so that in Judaism, it's kind of in some way, someone could say that all of Judaism as a religion is really built I guess there's two kind of key events in Judaism. One someone would say, listen, the foundational event of Judaism is the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. But the second foundational event of Judaism as a stateless nation or as a stateless religion is really the destruction of the temple. That's what gave birth to the reason. If the temple wasn't destroyed, there never would have been a Talmud. There never would have been the crypto-Jewish experience. And the house of God was destroyed. And actually, but before I go deeper into that, so let's go back to the Hebrew letter thing. So the 16th letter of the Hebrew Aleph Bet is Ayin. For those of you who know the Aleph Bet, I'll let you try to look for it here in this card. As usual, it's half present, but it's half hidden. It's hinted at, but not fully shown. Interesting enough, this figure is reminiscent of the shape of the letter Ayin. And there's a very unique connection between the letter Ayin and the memory of the destruction of the house of God. So in Judaism, there's a holiday every year, a day of mourning, a day of grief, in which we commemorate the destruction of the first house of God and the second house of God. It's Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av means literally the 9th day of the 11th month. If you zoom in really carefully on the sun, you will find that there is specifically 9 golden flames coming out from the sun, and there are 11 spots in the sun, which by coincidence aligns with Tisha B'Av is the 9th day of the 11th month in the civil calendar. It is an eerie, I guess we could say it's an eerie coincidence that the Jewish holiday for the commemoration of the two temples happens to be 9/11. So you can take, there's a lot of very creative Kabbalists online who write lots of interesting essays about that, but that's another conversation for another day. Let's acknowledge that and put that on the side. And there's one book that's really central. There's one book of the Bible that's very central to the development of Kabbalah. It's also, I would argue, very important. It was also very much on the minds of the artists of the Torah de Marseille. That is the book of Ezekiel. The book of Ezekiel opens up with the vision of the divine chariot, in which Ezekiel looks up and he sees 4 creatures with 4 faces and 4 wings that are holding up a holding up a figure who delivers him the terrible news that he has declared judgment against the temple in Jerusalem. The depiction of this divine chariot you can actually find on the 21st card of the Tarot de Marseille. So like I know for sure the book of Ezekiel was on this artist's mind, because the chariot itself is depicted on one of the tarot cards. But in the book of Ezekiel, there's a description of these burning coals of fire, suggestive of torches that move around, and that he tells the angels to take those glowing coals and to scatter them across the city. He then describes how the city will be so destitute that parents themselves will be forced to eat their children. He says in Ezekiel 21:31, it says, "Remove the turban and lift off the crown." Ezekiel 7:2 is doom, doom coming upon the four corners of the land. So these are all visual depictions of the destruction of the house of God. I would argue that these are all the artist is presenting visual depictions of these very specific lines from the book of Ezekiel. Interesting enough, if you count, there's 8 thorns in the crown. There are 30 orbs in the air. Several times in the Talmud and in different rabbinical writings, the rabbis explore the meaning of the fact that the temple stood for a total of 830 years. So there's 8 thorns and 30 globes. I don't know, that could be a coincidence. I don't know. For me, this is another example of like, this is too much. This is a signal to me that this artist, they were trying to convey as much as possible. They were conveying in a visual medium as much Judaic history as possible. They were conveying it in a way that would elude the prying eyes of someone who is not a friend, but that would communicate information. So for instance, like if I ever go somewhere and I want to remember how many years the 2 temples stood, I know it's in this card. But unless you're tipped of that, you would never know. You would never know that fact. If you count the number of rows of bricks in the card, you'll count there's a total of 22 rows of bricks. And the base is specifically 16 rows of bricks. Ayin, again, is the 16th letter in the Hebrew Aleph Bet. On Tisha B'Av, one of the most important, one of the things you're commanded to do, and again, Tisha B'Av is the holiday specifically to commemorate and mourn the destruction of the house of God, the destruction of Beit El, the Maison Dieu. Specifically, we read out the book of Lamentations, Eicha. It's sung out. One of this kind of a nuance in the book of Eicha is that it's a Hebrew acrostic, so that every verse of Eicha is another letter of the Aleph Bet in order. But the Aleph Bet in Eicha, it's broken. So ayin here usually comes before pei, but in Eicha it's specifically broken. Suddenly pei comes before ayin. The rabbis taught that there was a reason for this. Ayin, the letter ayin is actually a homonym for eye. Pei is a homonym for mouth. And they say that the reason the second Beit HaMikdash was destroyed is that because people spoke evil with their tongues before they saw good with their eyes. That people spoke evil, they spoke evil of their countrymen, and that is the reason why the temple was destroyed. So interesting enough, this card it's a hidden depiction. The ayin is falling, just how the ayin falls in the order of the letters in the book of Lamentations, the ayin is falling in this card. So again, it's a disguised depiction of the reading of Lamentations. And of course, I mean, for me, it's hard. It's not a stretch for me to see just the visual connection between the actual structure of the Kotel, of the Western Wall, and these bricks. So this is the sun card. Rider Waite Smith, they went in a very different direction. They did keep the wall in the background. So it's the 19th card. It's called the Sun. Some man who doesn't look terribly happy is embracing some woman who is, as you can tell, naked or partially naked, partially nude. There's a sun, there's spots in the sky, and there's a wall in the background. Now, what's interesting, this shape, this very unique shape of how they're holding their arms and legs has been replicated over and over again. This one has 2 Hebrew letters. Kuf is one of them. There's another card here. When you put them together, it makes sense. So Kuf is actually the first letter in the Hebrew word for Kodesh, which means holy. What is all right, so I'll show you. So I'll tell you where I think the Hebrew letters are. There is actually a shin in the negative space of their legs. And there's a kuf in the body of this gentleman, their arms and his body, kuf. And shin and kuf are the first letters in Shabbat Kodesh, the Holy Shabbat. Shabbat Kodesh is actually, and for those of you who don't know, preserving the Shabbat, the weekly day of rest, is one of the most treasured and precious and important mitzvot of Judaism. So a lot of people say that is really the line between truly observant Jews and non-observant Jews, are people who observe Shabbat. You could also probably say kashrut as well. Kashrut and Shabbat are the true, that's really the dividing line of those who really preserve the Torah. One Kabbalah said, if you preserve Shabbat, you're actually preserving all the mitzvot of the Torah. So if you don't know, so there is a Jewish tradition of giving a priestly benediction. So there's the Kohen actually does a priestly benediction of when he would raise his hands like this. And the idea is that the negative space of his hands would actually be in the shape of the letter Shin. So I believe the artist was kind of using that same symbolic technique, but now hiding the Shin in the negative space of their legs. So what is this connection? So there's a man and a naked woman. What possible connection could there be to Shabbat? Is it? All right. So every Friday night, we sing a song. Not everybody, but if you do, Let go, my beloved, to meet the bride. The bride is called the Shabbat bride. The central moment of Shabbat is when you greet the Shabbat bride. And this is what this is it's a literal depiction of a man greeting the bride. Does it seem overtly sexual? Yes, it does. And but that is the traditional understanding of Shabbat. And this is where we get into a little bit of a puzzle, because I can tell you the Kabbalists had a very elaborate sexual theology around Shabbat, about greeting of the Shabbat bride. And it was definitely considered a mitzvah, a double mitzvah, a commandment to specifically have relations with your wife on Friday night as you greet the Shabbat bride. So one interpretation is to say, oh, this artist is making a really visceral depiction of this Kabbalistic theology surrounding Shabbat. There's another voice, I don't know if this is true, another voice says, no, they're making this as vulgar as possible or as crass as possible, intentionally as part of the disguise. That if you saw this, you would never in your wildest dreams connect this traditional Judaism, because it is crass. I don't know what it is. I don't know what the truth is. I do think there's a very interesting puzzle in that there is a visible public display of a very secret aspect of Judaism at a time when Judaism was supposed to be secret. So there's like a puzzle wrapped in a puzzle inside a puzzle. There's a really deep mystery here as to what motivated the artist to make this literal visual depiction of the sexual greeting of the Shabbat bride. So were these artists, and I do think they were artists, because there's so much content here, it is so deep, that I don't think one person like made it over a weekend. I think there's so much Judaic content built in here that I think it was created by a community making iterative versions over years. But is this the product of a deep, faithful Kabbalist, or was it the product of someone who was primarily concerned about Jewish continuity and wanted to make a great disguise?